In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte commanded the most powerful army Europe had ever seen, over 600,000 men marching east under the proud banner of the Golden Eagle. Victory seemed inevitable. But instead of triumph, the Grande Armee met an enemy more ruthless than any army, winter itself. What began as a bold invasion of Russia ended as one of the greatest military disasters in history, where snow, hunger and frost destroyed an empire's dream. This is the story of how Napoleon's eagles froze in the Russian snow. By 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the absolute peak of his power, a man whose name alone reshaped the political map of Europe. In just over a decade, he had risen from an obscure Corsican officer to Emperor of the French, defeating coalition after coalition of Europe's greatest monarchies. Austria had been humbled, Prussia crushed, and much of Germany reorganized under French influence. Kings ruled only with his permission, and treaties carried his unmistakable stamp. To friends and enemies alike, Napoleon appeared unstoppable, a commander guided by destiny itself. The Grande Armee was the physical symbol of this dominance. It was not just an army but a moving empire, drawing soldiers from across Europe. French veterans marched beside Polish lancers, German infantry, Italian units, and allies forced into service. Over 600,000 men stood under Napoleon's command, making it the largest military force ever assembled in European history at that time. These soldiers were experienced, battle-hardened, and confident, shaped by years of near-constant victory. They believed in their emperor, and many believed they were part of history in the making. Napoleon himself had absolute faith in his military genius. His past campaigns had taught him that speed, decisive battles, and psychological shock could break any enemy. He had defeated larger forces before through superior maneuver and timing, and he believed Russia would be no different. To Napoleon, war was a science he had mastered. He trusted his calculations, his marshals, and his ability to bend events to his will. The idea that his judgment could fail seemed impossible to him. Politically, Napoleon dominated Europe through fear and loyalty combined. He placed relatives on thrones, rewarded allies with territory, and punished enemies without mercy. The continental system, his grand economic weapon against Britain, was enforced across most of the continent because no ruler dared openly defy him. His power rested not only on armies but on the belief that resistance was useless. Europe had learned that lesson repeatedly on battlefields from Austerlitz to Wagram. Yet beneath this image of invincibility, cracks were already forming. Governing such a vast empire strained resources, and the loyalty of many allies was thin and forced. The Grande Armée looked powerful, but it was expensive, complex, and dependent on long supply lines. Napoleon's victories had taught him confidence, but they had also taught him impatience. He had come to expect quick results, rapid surrender, and decisive endings to wars. Napoleon's personal ambition also played a crucial role in shaping his decisions. He was not content with stability, he sought permanence and legacy. He wanted an empire that would outlive him, secured by obedience and fear. Any challenge to his authority, no matter how distant, felt like a threat to the entire structure he had built. Russia's independence, therefore, was not just a political problem but a personal insult to his vision of Europe. By the summer of 1812, Napoleon believed history itself was on his side. Surrounded by advisors who rarely challenged him and generals who owed their glory to his favor, he marched east with supreme confidence. The Golden Eagles of the Grande Armée advanced under the assumption that victory was inevitable. None of them, not even Napoleon, truly understood that this campaign would mark the moment when his power reached its limit and began to collapse in the snow of Russia. The decision to invade Russia in 1812 was not sudden, nor was it driven by emotion alone. It was the result of mounting political tension, economic rivalry, and Napoleon's belief that his authority must remain unquestioned across Europe. At the center of the conflict stood the continental system, Napoleon's grand strategy to cripple Britain by cutting it off from European trade. For years this system had been enforced through French power and intimidation, and most European states complied out of fear rather than loyalty. Russia, however, proved to be a problem Napoleon could not ignore. Tsar Alexander I had initially agreed to the continental system after earlier defeats, but Russia's economy suffered badly under the blockade. British goods were vital to Russian trade, and smuggling became widespread. By 1810, Russia began openly relaxing the restrictions, effectively breaking Napoleon's economic weapon. To Napoleon, this was more than an economic dispute. It was an act of defiance that threatened the entire structure of his European dominance. Napoleon believed that if Russia could ignore his orders, others would soon follow. His empire relied heavily on perception, the belief that resistance was useless and punishment inevitable. Allowing Russia to step outside his control would signal weakness to Austria, Prussia, and countless smaller states waiting for an opportunity to break free. From Napoleon's perspective, the invasion was a necessary demonstration of power, meant to restore fear and obedience throughout Europe. There was also a deep personal element to the conflict. Relations between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I had deteriorated steadily after an initial period of cooperation. Both men saw themselves as rulers destined to shape Europe's future, and neither was willing to accept the other as an equal. Diplomatic letters grew colder, meetings ended without agreement, and mutual suspicion replaced earlier respect. The invasion became, in part, a clash of egos between two emperors unwilling to yield. Napoleon expected the Russian campaign to follow a familiar pattern. He assumed that a rapid advance and a few decisive battles would force the Russian army to fight, lose, and compel the Tsar to negotiate. This expectation was based on years of success against European armies that relied on defending capitals and maintaining supply centers. Napoleon believed that once he threatened Russia's heart, political collapse would follow just as it had elsewhere. What Napoleon failed to grasp was the fundamental difference between Russia and the rest of Europe. Russia was vast, thinly populated, and prepared to trade space for time. Its leadership understood that survival mattered more than territory, and that retreat was not defeat. Napoleon, accustomed to quick victories, underestimated both Russia's endurance and its willingness to suffer in order to deny him success. By choosing war, Napoleon committed himself to a campaign with no easy exit. Once the Grande Armee crossed into Russia, retreat would signal weakness, while advance would stretch his forces deeper into hostile land. The invasion was meant to enforce obedience and secure his empire, but it rested on flawed assumptions about Russia's strategy and resolve. In trying to protect his dominance, Napoleon set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately expose the limits of his power. In the early summer of 1812, the invasion of Russia began with a display of power unmatched in European history. As the Grande Armee crossed the Niemen River, the moment was carefully staged to project confidence and inevitability. Napoleon believed that the sheer size of his forces would intimidate Russia into offering battle and, soon after, peace. The army advanced in multiple columns, stretching across vast distances, a living symbol of imperial authority moving eastward. Almost immediately, reality clashed with expectation. The land through which the army marched was poor, sparsely populated, and unable to support such massive numbers. Roads were little more than dirt tracks, turning into dust in dry weather and mud after rain. Wagons broke down, horses weakened, and supply convoys lagged far behind the advancing troops. The logistical system that had supported Napoleon's earlier victories began to strain under the weight of this unprecedented campaign. Napoleon had planned to live off the land, a strategy that had worked well in Central Europe. In Russia, however, villages were small and widely spaced, offering little food or fodder. Soldiers quickly found themselves short of bread and meat, while horses, essential for transport, and cavalry, began to die in large numbers. Hunger weakened discipline, and looting became common, further alienating the local population. The sheer scale of the army also worked against itself. Columns stretched for miles, making coordination difficult and slowing movement. Orders took hours or even days to reach their destinations, and units often marched without clear knowledge of where neighboring forces were located. This lack of cohesion reduced Napoleon's ability to concentrate his army quickly for battle, one of his greatest tactical strengths. Heat added to the misery of the march. The summer of 1812 was unusually hot, and soldiers collapsed from exhaustion under the blazing sun. Water was scarce, uniforms were heavy, and disease spread rapidly through overcrowded camps. Thousands fell ill or died before a single major battle was fought, casualties not of combat but of environment and logistics. Meanwhile, the Russian army refused to stand and fight. Each time Napoleon advanced, the Russians pulled back, denying him the decisive engagement he sought. This constant retreat forced the French to march farther into Russian territory, stretching supply lines even thinner. The farther Napoleon went, the more difficult it became to sustain his army, yet turning back was unthinkable. By the time summer gave way to early autumn, the Grande Armee was already bleeding strength. Men, horses and equipment were being lost at an alarming rate, not to enemy fire but to distance, hunger and fatigue. The invasion that had begun with confidence and grandeur was slowly transforming into a struggle for survival, long before winter would deliver its final and most devastating blow. Keynote 3. The invasion of Russia began with confidence and ceremony, as if Napoleon were setting out on another swift march to glory. In June 1812, the Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River, marking the formal start of the campaign. Trumpets sounded, banners waved, and soldiers believed they were witnessing the opening of yet another legendary victory. Napoleon himself watched the crossing calmly, convinced that history would record this moment as the beginning of Russia's submission to his will. The army that moved eastward was vast beyond imagination. Columns stretched for miles, consuming roads, fields, and villages as they advanced. This was not a single national force, but a patchwork of Europe under French command. Languages mixed in the ranks, uniforms varied, and loyalty ranged from genuine devotion to quiet resentment. Yet the sheer size of the army created an illusion of invincibility, masking the dangers that came with such a massive force. Almost immediately, the realities of Russia's geography began to challenge Napoleon's assumptions. The roads were poor, often little more than dirt tracks that turned to mud under the weight of artillery and supply wagons. Movement slowed, formations broke apart, and coordination became difficult. The distances between towns were far greater than anything the army had faced in Central Europe, and each mile east stretched supply lines thinner. Napoleon had planned for his army to live off the land, a strategy that had worked in previous campaigns. In Russia, this assumption quickly proved fatal. Villages were small, crops limited, and local resources insufficient to feed hundreds of thousands of men and horses. Soldiers began to suffer hunger long before winter arrived, and discipline weakened as men scavenged desperately for food. The heat of summer added another layer of suffering. Marching under the sun, burdened with heavy equipment, soldiers collapsed from exhaustion. Water was often scarce or contaminated, leading to illness. Horses, essential for transport and artillery, began to die in alarming numbers. Each fallen horse meant fewer supplies could be moved, deepening the crisis with every passing day. Desertion soon followed hardship. Allied troops, especially those with little loyalty to Napoleon, slipped away when conditions worsened. Units shrank silently, sometimes without a single shot being fired. Disease spread through overcrowded camps, killing more men than Russian weapons at this early stage. The Grande Armée was bleeding strength without ever meeting the main enemy. By the time Napoleon realized the scale of the problem, he was already committed. The march east had gained momentum that could not be easily reversed. Turning back so early would damage his reputation and embolden his enemies across Europe. So the army pressed forward, carrying with it the growing weight of exhaustion, hunger, and doubt. What had begun as a confident advance was slowly transforming into a dangerous gamble, one where distance and logistics proved deadlier than any battlefield. While Napoleon pushed deeper into Russian territory, his enemies were shaping a strategy that would turn his strengths into weaknesses. Rather than confront the Grande Armée directly, Russian commanders chose to retreat. This decision was deeply unpopular among Russian officers and soldiers, who viewed withdrawal as humiliation. Cities were abandoned, ground was surrendered, and morale suffered. But the leadership understood that survival mattered more than pride. The Russian strategy was simple but brutal. As they retreated, they destroyed anything that could support Napoleon's army. Crops were burned, granaries emptied, and villages left in ruins. Wells were poisoned or filled with debris, leaving nothing behind but ashes and hunger. This scorched earth approach denied the French the ability to live off the land, forcing them to rely on fragile supply lines stretching back toward Europe. For Napoleon, this strategy was deeply frustrating. He had built his reputation on forcing enemies into decisive battles, crushing them quickly and ending wars in a single campaign. The Russians refused to play this game. Each retreat pulled the French farther from their bases, deeper into territory that offered nothing in return. Victory, once expected within weeks, began to feel distant and uncertain. The psychological impact of this retreat was enormous. French soldiers marched through empty towns and silent fields, sensing that they were being drawn into a trap. There were no cheering crowds, no captured capitals, no clear signs of progress. Instead, there was only distance and destruction. The enemy remained unseen, always just beyond reach, wearing down morale through absence rather than confrontation. Russian commanders understood their greatest ally was time. Every day Napoleon advanced, his army weakened. Hunger increased, horses died, and discipline eroded. The Russian army, though retreating, remained intact and increasingly confident. They could choose when and where to fight, knowing that Napoleon's position worsened with each step eastward. This strategy also relied on Russia's vastness. Unlike smaller European states, Russia could afford to lose territory without losing the war. Land could be retaken later. An army destroyed could not be replaced easily. By refusing decisive battle, the Russians preserved their forces while Napoleon's strength drained away invisibly. What looked like weakness was, in fact, calculated endurance. By the time Napoleon began to grasp the full meaning of the Russian retreat, the damage was already done. His army was exhausted, underfed, and spread thin across enormous distances. The scorched earth policy had transformed Russia itself into a weapon, turning geography into a silent battlefield. The Grande Armee marched forward, but every mile carried it closer not to victory, but to isolation, vulnerability, and eventual disaster. By September 1812, months of marching and retreat had finally led both armies toward a confrontation neither could avoid. Near the village of Borodino, west of Moscow, the Russian army at last turned to face Napoleon. For the French soldiers, this moment felt familiar and reassuring. A great battle was exactly what they had been waiting for, the kind of decisive clash that had always delivered victory in the past. Napoleon himself believed that one hard blow here would shatter Russian resistance and end the campaign. The battlefield at Borodino was grim and unforgiving. Rolling hills, shallow rivers, and hastily constructed earthworks defined the terrain. The Russians had fortified key positions, digging redoubts and trenches to absorb the French assault. Their army, commanded by General Kutuzov, stood not with confidence, but with determination. They did not expect an easy victory, but they were prepared to bleed rather than retreat again. For the first time in the campaign, Russia chose to stand its ground. The battle began at dawn on September 7, 1812, with thunderous artillery fire shaking the earth. Cannons roared for hours, filling the air with smoke and screams. French troops advanced again and again against Russian positions, capturing them at terrible cost, only to face brutal counterattacks. The fighting was savage and relentless, fought at close range with muskets, bayonets, and sheer desperation. Soldiers on both sides were cut down in staggering numbers within a few hours. Napoleon watched the battle unfold from a distance, calm but cautious. Unlike earlier campaigns, he hesitated to commit his elite imperial guard, his final reserve and most powerful weapon. He feared risking everything so far from France, deep inside enemy territory. This hesitation would later be questioned by historians, as the guard might have broken the Russian army completely. Instead, Napoleon chose caution, allowing the battle to grind on without delivering a decisive final blow. By late afternoon, the battlefield had become a scene of horror. Tens of thousands lay dead or wounded, the ground soaked with blood. the Russians gradually withdrew from their most forward positions, giving the impression of a French victory. Technically, Napoleon had won the field, but the cost was shocking. The Grande Armee had suffered losses it could not easily replace, especially so far from its supply bases and reinforcements. Most importantly, the Russian army was not destroyed. Despite enormous casualties, it remained intact and capable of fighting. Kutuzov ordered a withdrawal that very night, preserving the core of his forces. There was no surrender, no collapse, and no plea for peace. For the first time in his career, Napoleon had won a massive battle without gaining the strategic result he expected. Victory brought no resolution. The Battle of Borodino marked a turning point in the campaign. It shattered the illusion that a single battle would end the war. Napoleon marched on toward Moscow, but the shadow of Borodino followed him, his